The General Assembly of the United Nations is currently having its annual session in New York, and this is often used by world leaders as a platform to state their views and policies and to set out the positions of their countries. This particular United Nations session, General Assembly session, seems to have been, if I have to say it frankly, a rather understated affair. President Biden of the United States gave a speech which I thought was extraordinarily bland and uneventful, and which seemed to me to attract little interest either in the audience or in the wider world. Certainly it didn't break any new ground or say anything remotely interesting. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, attended in a virtual fashion. He sent a speech to the General Assembly. To be straightforward about this, I didn't think that was a particularly interesting speech either. President Putin of Russia has kept well away. There have been other world leaders who've spoken on the fringes, and there's the usual horse trading and negotiating and dealing going on in the corridors of the UN building, but nothing of any great interest and anything really remarkable seems to have taken place there. The exception to this rule, as to so many others, is President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, before I discuss his activities in New York and elsewhere, I will just say that, and not for the first time, by the way, that I'm perfectly well aware that President Erdogan's surname is pronounced slightly differently from the way that I pronounce it. I'm afraid I've tried many times to get the pronunciation right. I simply can't manage it, and I've just abandoned the effort. We all know who I mean, and I mean no disrespect to Erdogan or to anyone else by calling him Erdogan rather than using the Turkish pronunciation of his name. I apologize for it, but there it is. Anyway, President Erdogan duly came to the United Nations session, and he participated fully in it and has taken some big decisions along the way. And it's fair to say that he seems to have gone out of his way to draw as much attention to himself as possible. Firstly, he's been touring around New York, around Manhattan, in a simply gigantic motorcade, one which dwarfs those of many other leaders of arguably more important countries. Then, in the speech that he gave to the UN General Assembly session, he seems to have gone out of his way to be at least, well, perhaps not exactly rude, but to say things that might be calculated to annoy all the great powers, except, interestingly, for China. So he spoke about the fact that Turkey continues to recognize Ukraine's sovereignty of Crimea and its territorial integrity, which includes Crimea, a fact which is calculated to annoy and exasperate the Russians. And this shortly before Erdogan is due to travel to Russia to meet with President Putin in the Russian resort city of Sochi. But at the same time as he says things which the Russians won't like to hear, he also makes comments about other countries. He talks about the United States. He castigates the West for its rising Islamophobia. He hints at his support of the events of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, that he's careful not to say that straightforwardly. And he also annoys the Indians by making comments about Kashmir. Comments which are, it should be said, perhaps neutral, but the Indians will not like any reference to Kashmir at an international session. And if we look at the leaders of the other great powers, they are very careful to avoid touching on that sensitive subject, at least as far as India is concerned. So, on the one hand, Erdogan makes a big splash at the UN General Assembly, where, as I said, he makes this speech which seems to be calculated to provoke annoyance on the part of all the great powers. At the same time, he's made various comments off the stage of the United Nations General Assembly. He's spoken about how relations between the United States and Turkey are not healthy. He said the following: "I cannot say that a healthy process is running in the Turkish-American ties. It is my hope that as two NATO countries, we should treat each other with friendship, not hostility. But the current trajectory does not bode well." And of course, and on top of that, he made it absolutely clear yet again that he has no intention of pulling out of the S-400 deal with Russia, which is the deal which, of course, the United States has taken so much strong objection to. And moreover, his team have been hinting or dropping big hints that they expect big things out of the meeting between Erdogan and Putin next week. Alongside all of these events, we have steps taken by Erdogan in Turkey itself. At the same time as all other countries, or the other big central banks, I should say, seem to be tightening monetary policy and raising interest rates to fight worldwide inflation, Erdogan does the opposite. He puts pressure on the Turkish central bank to cut interest rates, which has caused the Turkish currency, the lira, to crash to almost its lowest ever levels. So we see Erdogan making a splash at the United Nations, taking big moves, making big moves, and if you like, counterintuitive moves, though not for him, arguably, in Turkey, in the way that he manages the economy, and at the same time saying things that many of the great powers, the United States, India, Russia, might not want to hear. He is also clearly indicating, by the way, by his comments about Islamophobia, that he's not particularly friendly towards the European Union either. If foreign policy consists of being rude and difficult to everybody, then it must be said that President Erdogan of Turkey is the virtuoso at this particular game. But is there some method to this? Is Erdogan actually doing something here which is actually pointing to a future trajectory for his foreign policy? Or are all these moves part of some sort of overall plan? Or is this just the impulsive actions of a reckless leader who is steadily losing the plot? Well, the British website Al Monitor, which covers the Middle East affairs and which discusses Turkey at considerable length, though it must be said from a very British and Western perspective, takes the clear view that nothing that Erdogan does is impulsive, that he is a politician who calculates his statements and his moves very carefully, and that all of his statements are very carefully pre-prepared. Now, I don't always agree with Al Monitor about many things, but I do agree about that. I think that Erdogan is always someone who weighs and prepares his words carefully and who says things which he intends to be very much in his interests and to a certain extent in Turkey's interests too. So why is he acting in this increasingly odd way, or at least a way that some people might find odd, at the UN General Assembly? Well, the first thing to say about Erdogan is that he is under a great deal of political pressure at the moment. There's been defeats for his party in elections in many of the big cities in Turkey, places like Ankara, Izmir, and above all, Istanbul. The Turkish economy has not been doing particularly well recently. Turkey is affected by inflation, just as the rest of the world is, but perhaps arguably more so. And there's been considerable problems in Turkey, and these problems arguably are mounting. Last but not least, as I've discussed both on this channel and in our main channel, the Duran, with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, Erdogan has to face the problem of a neocon grouping that has come together in Washington, led by the notorious neocon John Bolton, Donald Trump's former national security advisor, which is quite obviously lobbying and preparing for regime change in Turkey, which is intended to target Erdogan himself. So what Erdogan does is that he pitches his comment in the General Assembly and his actions with the Turkish Central Bank to appeal to his political constituency in Turkey. So firstly, he tours New York in his gigantic motorcade to emphasize what an important leader he is. And then he comes along and he says things about India, about the United States, about Russia, which again emphasize what an important leader on the world stage he is and what an important country, by definition and extension, Turkey has become under his leadership. And that's why he makes all of these critical comments about Crimea, Kashmir, and all the rest. Now, I would say that there is a paradox which will be lost on very few people around the world, that at one and the same time that Erdogan talks about Crimea and about the inappropriateness of Russian actions in Crimea and makes similar hints about Kashmir, though he was careful not to go quite so far on the Kashmir issue, he is purposefully blind to the fact that what the Russians did in Crimea, or are alleged to have done in Crimea, is essentially the same thing as what Turkey did in Cyprus in 1974, where Turkey sent an army into Cyprus purportedly to protect the Turkish people there, and occupies to this day the northern part of the island and has imposed a de facto partition over the island, disregarding its territorial integrity, which has been reaffirmed in United Nations resolutions. But at the same time as Erdogan does that, and as I said, he's perfectly aware of that paradox, he at the same time calls for international recognition of the Turkish statelet in Cyprus. So he doesn't just disregard the parallels between Turkish actions and Russian actions in Crimea, but he also goes further. He actually asks the international community to go the extra mile and recognize the partition of Cyprus and the Turkish statelet in Cyprus, even as he denies the right of Crimea to act upon its desire to secede from Ukraine and to unify with Russia. And of course, Erdogan is not oblivious to this paradox, but he's perfectly aware, again, that his electorate in Turkey is completely uninterested in these niceties as far as they're concerned. He is standing up for Turkey in Cyprus. He's standing up for Turkey against the old enemy Russia in Crimea, a former part, by the way, of the old Ottoman Empire. And of course, he cuts again a big figure on the world stage. But I think there is also something more to this. And here I'm going to make a few observations about Turkish policy and Turkish interests and the fraught relations Turkey has, both with the United States and perhaps the rather more complicated relations it has with the Russians. Now, there's been much discussion about this, but I think the first point to make here is that when it comes to the United States, Erdogan has, from his point of view, certain very legitimate grievances. Now, the key issue, and one which Westerners consistently ignore, is US support for the Kurdish militias in Syria. The fact is that the United States, in pursuit of its policy of trying to destabilize the government of President Bashar al-Assad, is occupying large territories in northeast Syria and has forged a de facto alliance in these territories with the Kurdish militia. Now, the Kurdish militia in northeast Syria is aligned with Kurdish movements, political movements in Turkey itself, which have in the past, and to some extent still, seek independence for Kurdistan from Turkey. No Turkish leader can look upon these actions by the United States in northeast Turkey in northeast Syria with any degree of sympathy or favour. And the Turks, not just Erdogan, but many Turkish officials, have tried repeatedly to get the United States to understand this, and the United States is utterly oblivious and heedless of this. Now, many people who discuss the deterioration in Turkish-US relations like to point to Erdogan's deal to buy S-400 surface-to-air missiles from Russia as the single decision which caused the relationship between Turkey and the United States to deteriorate. From Erdogan's point of view, the S-400 deal is a minor matter. As far as he is concerned, this is just a missile system which has been integrated into the Turkish air defense system. It provides Turkey with some degree of influence, leverage, if you like, with Russia, but it is hardly a challenge or a threat to the strategic position of the United States. By contrast, US support for the Kurdish militia in northeast Syria is an existential issue for Turkey, not just for Erdogan. If the Kurds in northeast Syria were ever to succeed, perhaps with US backing, to carve out an independent state for themselves in these territories, that would be a deadly challenge to Turkey. It might be an inspiration to Turkey's own Kurdish minority to rise up against Turkey and to seek perhaps union with this Kurdish state that had developed in northeast Syria. And beyond that, and in addition to that, there is always the risk, the major concern, that the Kurdish militia in Turkey, in Syria, which has had connections with Kurdish groups that have fought the Turkish government within Turkey itself, that the Kurds in Syria might provide a refuge, a sanctuary for these Kurdish groups in Turkey, which have been fighting the Turkish government, and might actually provide them with a launch pad and a base for any kind of insurgency or guerrilla war that they might want to launch against Turkey within Turkey itself. This is for Turkey, for Erdogan, for all Turkish officials, for the Turkish military, for the Turkish Foreign Office, for the Turkish civil service, and for large sections of Turkish population, a strategic nightmare. It is, as I said, an existential issue. And I'm never sure to what extent the US government, obsessed as it is with its games in Syria, has ever really understood that. Certainly, it has never shown much sympathy or concern for Turkish feelings about the Kurdish issue in Syria, and it has never shown any sense or understanding of the fact that it needs to act in a way in Syria that addresses these overriding Turkish concerns. Now, this comes on top of something else, which is that when it comes to Syria itself, Erdogan is fully justified in feeling that the Americans have very badly let him down and very badly let Turkey down. Now, back in 2012, when the war in Syria really took off, Erdogan and Turkey were persuaded to some extent at that time, against their better judgment, to support the insurgency against President Assad in Syria. I say that because up to then, certainly until 2011, Turkey and President Erdogan in particular had forged a very friendly and very close relationship with President Assad's government in Damascus. And Erdogan and the Turkish government were understandably somewhat nervous about putting all that at risk and in jeopardy by trying to join a crusade to overthrow Assad's government in Damascus, which would possibly negate Turkish influence in Syria by causing the overthrow of a government in Damascus, which had up to that point been friendly to Turkey, or if that government was not overthrown, by converting that government into an enemy of Turkey. But nonetheless, Erdogan did that, and he did that for two reasons. Firstly, he did that because he had to, at all times, take into account the very strong Islamist feelings of his electorate within Turkey, which sympathized with the jihadi insurgency within Syria. And of course, he partly, and in fact to a great extent, shares these feelings, these sentiments himself. But beyond that, there is no doubt at all that the Americans and the British especially gave him to think that President Assad's government was certain to fall. When Erdogan decided to back the insurgency in Syria, he did so, as he thought, in the sure knowledge that Assad was going to fall, that the jihadi fighters in Syria would win, and that they would ultimately forge some kind of alliance with Erdogan and with Turkey, which would be even closer to the alliance that, or rather the friendship that Turkey had had with the Assad government in Syria. And partly this was based upon Turkish beliefs, which were again strongly encouraged by the Western powers, as I very well remember, that if the jihadi fighters by themselves were not able to fight and defeat President Assad's forces, the United States and its allies would intervene militarily, as they had elsewhere in the Middle East, and would fight a regime change war against Syria, which would, of course, have ended and resulted in the fall of President Assad's government. And what Erdogan discovered is that the United States, by this point, burnt and disillusioned by its experiences in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, was initially very reluctant to get drawn into an outright war in Syria. When there was an attempt in 2013 by President Obama's administration to launch a massive bombing campaign in Syria following an alleged chemical attack by the Syrian government in the eastern suburb in the suburbs of Damascus, the area known as Ghouta, American opposition within the United States, within Congress, proved so strong that President Obama eventually had to call that idea off and instead agreed to a deal brokered by the Russians for the Syrians to give up their chemical weapons. And that was something of a shock to President Erdogan, but there was an even greater shock which came 2 years later, because in 2015, President Erdogan was given further assurances by the United States that military intervention by the United States was pending. And again, I remember this very well. It's not often discussed now, but over the summer of 2015, the United States appeared to be edging towards an agreement with President Erdogan and with the Turkish government President and the Turkish government to declare a US policed no-fly zone over Syria. Now, it's important always to understand that a no-fly zone is now code word for a bombing campaign. And had events taken their normal course in 2015, then by the end of that year, by December 2015, the United States would have been bombing Syrian military installations across Syria, at which point, of course, the collapse of President Assad's government would have been only a matter of time. And of course that didn't happen. And the reason that didn't happen was because in September 2015, Russia, increasingly alarmed by reports about the intended declaration by the United States of a no-fly zone over Syria, intervened in Syria, sent its air force into Syria, and in effect told the United States that if it did try to impose such a no-fly zone in Syria, it would have to come up against the Russian Air Force. The United States was not prepared to do that, and that idea of a no-fly zone over Syria was finally and comprehensively called off. Now, the result is that the war in Syria, which at one point it looked as if President Assad would lose, he has since gone on to a great extent to win. And we have seen how, since that Russian intervention in 2015, President Assad's army, re-equipped and resupplied by the Russians and receiving a great deal of training from the Russians, has steadily, incrementally extended its control over nearly all of Syria. As I discussed in a recent program, it has recently regained control of the important southern town of Duran and is now in open discussions with the Jordanian and Egyptian governments. And that, of course, has left President Erdogan and Turkey holed up in a small area, in one single area of Syria, Idlib province, or parts of Idlib province, where they're trying to protect the remnants of the jihadi forces that have become concentrated there, and with the rest of Syria now under the control of an Assad government, which is now openly and strongly hostile to Turkey. So President Erdogan has very good reasons to feel deeply let down by the United States over the war in Syria. He intervened in Syria expecting that there would be a quick and easy victory there, one backed by the United States, where Turkey would make easy pickings. In the process, he sacrificed his relationship with President Assad, and as a result, everything has turned to dust. His entire Syrian policy is in ruins. He's holed up with his jihadi allies in Idlib province without much to show. And on top of that, he's got the United States in alliance with the Kurdish militia in northeast Syria. It would not be surprising if President Erdogan felt deeply aggrieved by all of this. And on top of all of that, there was an event that took place a year after the Russian intervention in Syria. And that was an attempted coup against President Erdogan's government in 2016. Now, there is a great deal of uncertainty and speculation and discussion about the nature of this coup and who was behind it and whether the United States was involved or not. I'm not going to discuss that in this program, but suffice to say that President Erdogan, who follows the news and listens very carefully to what the international media says, cannot have failed to notice that both the United States and European governments gave the strong impression, whilst the coup was underway, that they would not have been sorry to see the coup succeed and his government to fall. And of course, that too has poisoned President Erdogan's relationship with the West and has given him a particular grievance against the United States, because the leaders, or the people that President Erdogan claims are the ringleaders of the coup, a religious leader and his group, have been able to gain sanctuary in the United States, and as a result are beyond his reach. So he's got those issues on top of his feelings of betrayal over Syria, which have prejudiced his relations with the United States. And then, of course, there is the further factor that recently the new administration that came to power in Washington this January has edged towards taking even stronger and more clear-cut anti-Turkish positions as Erdogan would see them. Firstly, it has taken the step, I think an entirely correct step, by the way, of recognising the Armenian genocide, which took place in the early 20th century, something which no Turkish government is prepared to acknowledge and which President Erdogan certainly refuses to acknowledge, and which he has construed, and which many other people in Turkey construe, as an anti-Turkish step. And then on top of that, there have been various criticisms of Turkey and a notably cold meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and Turkish officials, in which Blinken referred to Turkey just as a NATO ally, as opposed to a friend, a strategic partner, or something like that, the more fulsome language that the United States used to use about Turkey in the past. So from President Erdogan's point of view, all of this is extremely difficult and very annoying. And on top of that, as I said at the outset of this program, he has to worry now about the fact that a neocon grouping has emerged in the United States, which is clearly targeting him and is seeking his overthrow. So, as a result of all this disillusionment with the United States and with the West, President Erdogan has sought to forge closer relations with the old enemy, Turkey's historic and traditional enemy, Russia, the country with which Turkey has fought numerous wars since the 18th century, wars over the course of which Turkey was consistently defeated, leading to vast losses of territory to Russia, something which many Turks to this day continue to remember and a few Turks resent, but nonetheless the country which seems to be willing to work with Turkey and with Erdogan in ways that the United States is not prepared to do. And as a result, especially since 2016, Erdogan has worked very hard in his own rather idiosyncratic way to develop a close relationship with Russia. If you go to President Putin's website, you will find endless telephone calls from President Erdogan to President Putin, telephone calls which I suspect Putin finds sometimes rather difficult calls President Erdogan is a difficult man, but which nonetheless do speak of the intensity and depth of the interaction between these two leaders. And along with this strong diplomatic engagement, there is now an increasingly strong economic engagement also. There is considerable mutual investment, both by Turkish business people in the Russian economy and increasingly by Russia in the Turkish economy. The Russians are working on building nuclear power stations in Turkey. They've cooperated with Turkey in building the Turk Stream pipeline, which brings natural gas to Turkey and which is turning Turkey into an important gas hub. And of course, and not to be overlooked, there is this very large annual movement of Russian holidaymakers to Turkey, to the various Turkish resorts along the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which has become extremely important, not just for the Turkish economy overall, but also for the many Turkish business people, the restaurant, cafe owners, the hoteliers, the people in the service sector, who form an absolutely key part of President Erdogan's political base. And in addition, and moreover, Russia, especially since the sanctions wars that began between Russia and the West in earnest in 2014, has sourced much of its Mediterranean produce that it previously used to import from the European Union from Turkey. And the Russians import fruit and tomatoes and cheese and those kind of products from Turkey, and that has also become an increasingly important part and aspect of the Turkish economy. But at the same time as all of this is happening, President Erdogan probably realizes that he has to avoid an absolute breakdown of relations with the West, and he can't at the same time entirely afford to disregard the sentiments that many Turkish people still have towards Russia. And that is why I think partly why he makes all these extraordinary comments, which the Russians find extremely grating, about Crimea, and why he also tries to meddle in places like the Caucasus, tries to back countries like Azerbaijan, for example, in its conflict with Armenia. He does it partly because he needs to reassure the United States that he's not actually drifting into an outright alliance with Russia, something which might cause the United States to break off relations with Turkey entirely, which could be potentially extremely dangerous for Turkey's economy, and which might intensify American attempts to overthrow President Erdogan's government. But on top of that, these moves over Crimea, which, as I said, used to be Turkish right up until the late 18th century, and where there is a Crimean Tatar population, which many Turks still identify with, and of course over Azerbaijan, these moves at least are intended, at least in part, to appeal to the pan-Turkic sentiments of at least a part of Erdogan's electoral base. So Erdogan is trying to play this very difficult game. He wants to balance the Americans against the Russians. He's trying to keep at least some doors open to the United States, even though he finds relations with the United States increasingly difficult. He has to work very hard at the same time to keep relations with Russia on an even keel. He doesn't want to commit too strongly to Russia. He doesn't want to break entirely with the United States. He wants to keep his options open with NATO, even at the same time as he sometimes talks about making Turkey a member of the Russian and Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is becoming an increasingly difficult game of balance for Erdogan to play. One has to say that until fairly recently, he's played it with some skill. And I think he finds that with the Russians at least understand what he's about and extend to him a certain degree of understanding and tolerance, though it's also true to say that they are not happy with his comments about Crimea, and they're becoming increasingly impatient by his reluctance to break with his jihadi allies in Syria's Idlib province. But at least the Russians show him some degree of understanding, and they have up to now, as I said, been prepared to work with him. His problems, Erdogan's real problems, and they are getting greater all the time, are with the United States, which is becoming increasingly intolerant of his actions. And one senses that with the change of administrations that took place in Washington earlier this year, President Erdogan lost an important friend in President Trump, who was someone who at least seemed to have some glimmer of understanding of the difficulties that President Erdogan faces as he tries to maintain Turkish policy, tries to keep all the various groupings and factions in Turkey that make up his electoral constituency in balance, and as he seeks to try and position Turkey to the best extent that he can as a leading country, but also as a country that faces enormous pressures as a result of US support for the Kurds in Syria. So Trump showed some understanding of this. It's quite clear that the Biden-Harris administration does not. Now, what therefore is going to happen? I want to repeat again, and this is something which, as I said, I think Westerners find very difficult to understand, that the single issue, the most important issue for Erdogan and for Turkey is the issue of the Kurds in Syria and US support for them. For Turkey, as I said, this is an existential issue. So long as the United States sticks to that policy, Turkey will become increasingly restless and increasingly distant from the United States, and will unavoidably start to ensure itself by taking steps to improve its relations with America's adversaries, China and Russia. If the United States, on the contrary, were to change its policy towards the Kurds in northeast Syria, then Turkish policy, I suspect, would change and change very quickly, and we would see a rebalancing of Turkish relations with the United States, with Turkey, I suspect, even under President Erdogan, reintegrating itself to a much greater extent into the US-led alliance system, the collective West, if you like, taking a bigger and more active role in NATO and starting to distance itself from Russia. But the United States shows no sign of making that kind of adjustment. And the result is that we see Erdogan, under all these competing pressures, coming to the UN, to the UN General Assembly, making comments there critical of the United States and of its policies, and at the same time preparing to meet with President Putin in Sochi in a week's time. If you wanted to create a policy mix best calculated to alienate and drive away one of your staunchest allies, you would follow the policy mix that the United States has been pursuing towards Turkey since the period of the Obama administration. It is astonishing to me that so few Americans seem to understand that. Now, perhaps that is a direction that the United States, after considering all the options, wants to take. Perhaps American policy, after the United States reflects on what it is doing, has decided that with somebody like President Erdogan in charge in Turkey, with Turkey showing increasing independence from the United States, perhaps the United States wants to reduce its relations with Turkey. Perhaps the United States feels that the war in Syria is indeed more important to US national interests than the long-term relationship with Turkey. But if that is indeed the case, then one would like to see an open debate about that taking place in Washington, a full recognition of what that means, and the United States perhaps at that point making a decision, a formal and open decision that is going to try to move beyond its old alliance with Turkey and start to develop its foreign policy in a way that no longer assumes the existence of that alliance. In that case, we would probably see US-Turkish relations actually have a less edgy quality than what we see today, because both the United States and the Turks would at that point know what the nature of the relationship is. But as is so often the case, that's not what the United States is doing. Instead, it wants to have it both ways. It wants to support the Kurds in Syria. It wants to pursue its policy of destabilizing President Assad's government. It continues to show a desire to back Armenia against Azerbaijan as a way of trying to extend US influence into the Caucasus and at the same time support the powerful Armenian lobby in the United States. And it shows an extraordinary disregard, contempt even, for Turkish interests and Turkish policies. At the same time, it also shows no understanding of why Turkey might want to ensure itself by buying S-400 missile systems from Russia, and it has gone into what looks to me, and I think looks to many Turks, as a gigantic sulk over this issue, and has sought to punish Turkey because of it. Now, of course, if the United States wants to continue to play that kind of game, if it wants to, as we say in Britain, have its cake and eat it as well, where Turkey is concerned, perhaps it should not be surprised that not just President Erdogan, but many Turks as well are finding themselves increasingly exasperated by the US and becoming more antagonistic towards it. Now, in my opinion, there is plenty of time and space for things to be turned round. I think that the United States, if it were to adjust its policies towards Turkey, show Turkey much greater understanding and respect than it has done, then I think Turkish interests would still point to Turkey wanting to remain a part of the US-led alliance system. But if we continue on the present course over the next 2 years, the United States demanding Turkish loyalty, even as it acts against vital, essential Turkish interests, then perhaps, and in time, we might even see that rupture in relations between the United States and Turkey, which I, for one, once upon a time, would never have imagined possible. I don't think we are at that point yet, but we seem to be heading in that direction. And it seems to me that President Erdogan, difficult man though he is, difficult to trust, very difficult to work with, does nonetheless embody within himself many of the concerns and many of the dilemmas that many Turkish people have and ought to be understood and related to in that way. The Russians have to some extent, to a great extent, shown the patience and understanding to work with him, I suspect, because they understand this fact. The sooner this is understood in the United States, the better US policy towards Turkey will be. Otherwise, if the US doesn't understand this and doesn't adjust to it, well then it could very well be that in 20, 30 years' time, we could start to see long books and articles and commentaries and research papers appearing in the United States about how the United States lost Turkey, just as in the 1950s we used to see books about how the United States lost China, and just as in the United States today you find a whole little literature appearing about how the United States lost Russia. Well, those who don't learn from their mistakes seem always destined to repeat them. Whether the United States is able to learn from its mistakes with respect to Turkey, I don't know. Whether the United States even understands the need to change its policies or the fact that it is actually making mistakes with Turkey, that I don't know either. But as somebody who knows Turkey fairly well, I have to say that I am surprised that relations between Turkey and the United States have been allowed by Washington to become as bad as they are, and there is no sign so far of them getting better. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also join us on our other platforms, especially Locals, where we have a thriving community and where we're increasingly publishing exclusive content. And also not just Locals, we're also on other platforms too, like the new free speech platform SuperU, but also other platforms like BitChute, Library, Rumble and ODYSEE. And if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there, our famous Duran magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And if you like this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel and elsewhere on our other platforms and on our main channel, the Duran, and have a wonderful day until then.